I am super happy to be sharing this presentation with you today, not only to help those of you that are counselors or nurses or teachers or parents, caregivers, and any capacity, but also to help those of you who may be grieving. It's a hard discussion to have. It's a necessary discussion to have. We all deal with death at some point in time in our life. And I don't think it is until we lose someone extremely close to us that we really gain a depth of empathy and understanding as to how that grief feels. And of course, grief is different for everyone. We all grieve differently. We all process things differently. And so, some of the things that I'll be talking about today, it may not be something that you've experienced, but it might be something that someone else may experience. But also, I think it helps to normalize grief, what that looks like. It's a natural part of life. Like I said, we all go through it and it's a normal part of life. And so it's important to be able to have these discussions. I do want to start off by saying that this was a super difficult presentation for me to put together. Not on the research part or the kind of putting it together, although I did have a little bit of trouble with that too. I think it was the topic because it is such a fresh thing that I'm dealing with, and I'll get into that a little bit. It was really tough to put together, so I think it's important for us to all start off by, and I need this myself, but by taking a deep breath and just allowing that difficulty, those difficult feelings that we have, to just kind of sit there and exhale them out as we breathe out. So important to be able to do that. I also want to send all of you a virtual hug for those of you who are grieving, or may know someone who are grieving, or who are caring for someone who is grieving. It's a hard road to walk. It's a long road, but it's not something that we have to do alone. And I'm so grateful to be a grief therapist. So I get to help people, every day walk through this. And like Chloe mentioned, I've been in the field for about, well, now it's like 14 years, but it's hard to believe that's gone by so fast. And about 3 years ago, I came on board as director at Paloma Place. And I'm also a therapist here working with children and their families who are dealing with grief and loss, as well as a lot of trauma, a lot of deep trauma that some of these families are dealing with. And so I'm able to help them by listening to them and learning about their stories because I don't know their grief. I ask them to, teach me about your grief. What does this feel like for you? And I do EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a specialized type of trauma therapy, which is phenomenal, especially for grief that comes along with trauma. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, just about how grief can be complicated by trauma or by other types of issues. So this is going to be the hard part for me, but I'm going to share a little bit about my personal journey through grief. So, this guy right here, I may tear up a little bit. I'm going to do my best not to cry, but this is Justice Lee Evans, my precious nephew. So, he was my first nephew of my sister and her husband, my sister Dwan and her husband Josh. And he was born May 27th, 2016. And this child brought so much joy to my life. This is actually the picture that was in his obituary. And I mean, this was him all the time. Like his hair was just crazy and he had a dirty little face and he was always playing outside and he had such a joy for life. He loved dinosaurs and he loved tacos, and so many things about this child made me, really grasp onto things and appreciate things. And so I built this great relationship with him. So this little guy sometimes would call me in the early mornings, like on FaceTime, and my sister would say, "Ashley, I am so sorry that he's calling you." And he would say, "I love you, Atlee." And I would be like, "I love you too." I was like, "You can call me anytime that you want. It's okay. I don't care what time it is." So this is my guy right here, Justice Lee. And so a few years down the road, and actually in late August of 2019, Justice was having some difficulties, and my sister and her husband didn't know what was going on. So, long story short, he was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. Um, just a devastating diagnosis. I still think of that time and what my sister and her husband were going through. Um, Losing a child from what I understand, is the hardest pain that anyone can ever go through. And this is the closest that I've been to that. And it was so excruciatingly painful. And so Justice was diagnosed and he ended up going into treatment at St. Jude. The standard treatment is radiation and sometimes chemo, and there are different trials. The type of tumor that he has or had 100% fatal, 9 months, it's the typical time that a child was given to live. And so dealing with this news and kind of trying to process it, then in March of 2020, my grandmother died. And so I went to her funeral. And then right during that week is when the COVID lockdown started. So just a lot of things back to back to back. Then and on May 3rd of 2020, I got early in that morning a text from my sister saying that Justice was with Jesus. And so that was really, really hard. And it took it's still painful. So he died May 3rd of 2020, and then his birthday was May 27th. So we had a birthday celebration of life celebration for him. And then at the end of 2020, I had a friend who died of cancer. She had been a college roommate. So I was just like so overwhelmed. And I'm a grief therapist. So, how do I grieve myself while making sure that I'm taking care of myself, my clients, my children? I have two daughters, and being there, for my family as we were all grieving. It was a journey that I just can't quite explain, and I'm still on this journey. I needed to figure out how to put the pieces together to figure out, how do I grieve? How do I care for my family as they grieve? And how do I do grief therapy as a grief therapist? It was a long road. It was, and it's still a journey that I'm on. And I've learned so much through all of this, though, despite the pain. There were things that I learned that I don't think I would have learned otherwise. It breaks my heart that it had to happen in this way. But when we go through something extremely painful and emotional, it teaches us something. We may not see it during that time, but there will be a time when we'll realize, okay, this is what I learned from this. And that came for me a few months after he died. And I've noticed that there are certain times that I realize I learned this from the situation. It was horrible. It was painful, but I learned this. And so we're just going to talk a little bit today about, excuse me, dealing with grief, and being able to take care of ourselves and also take care of others. And what can we learn from the grief that we've gone through? So just to kind of briefly go over the objectives, we're going to talk a little bit about the grieving process today. It's important to understand it. And many of those who already work in the grief field will know some of the things that I talk about. I've tried to add in a few things that I've found in articles and research that I thought was really interesting that I hadn't thought about before. Um, Also want to be able to identify the effect of grief on ourself and others. We want to recognize, how are we grieving? Where do we see others at in their grief? And then most importantly is to identify helpful self-care strategies and resources. And thankfully, there are so many things that we can do that will help us to heal and walk through this process. I wanted to touch a little bit on the emotional aspects of grief. There's so many, and sometimes it's hard to pinpoint what feelings that we're having. I think some of the typical emotional grief reactions is just disbelief, excuse me, that how could this have happened, or how can this be real? Of course, there's the sadness that goes along with it, anger. This isn't fair. How could this have happened to, like, for example, a child? Um, it's not fair. Then sometimes, and this is an interesting one, relief. How can it be that a person feels a relief when someone that they love has died? In my case, I knew that Justice wasn't in pain anymore. He had to go through radiation and chemo, and the child, I mean, he had two brain surgeries, and he had to go through all of that. And I had that relief, that small bit of relief that he wasn't in pain or having to go through that anymore. Then there's also fear. We fear something happening to other people in our lives, and there's sometimes guilt. And I'll touch on that a little bit when I talk about ways in which our loved ones die, how that can affect us. And then, of course, anxiety. I think that fits in with the fear. We have worry, like, what if this happens to someone else that I love? Or what if we're beating ourselves up about not noticing that someone that we love was perhaps extremely depressed and perhaps suicidal. So there's so many different complicated emotions that happen when we're grieving. Not only do we experience the emotional aspects of grief, but there's also physical symptoms that we experience. And I'll talk about this a little bit. There's a reason these things happen. Um, Loss of appetite. I had a lot of trouble eating when Justice died. I think I was just so sad, and there was that physical pain and that emotional pain that made it difficult for me. Headaches, chest pain, that is a one that I struggled with as well. I think it's almost like, I think there's a reason they call it a heartbreak, because you can feel that in the area of your heart. There's fatigue. Many times a person's not sleeping well, or they're having bad dreams, insomnia as well. And again, upsetting dreams. These are some of the typical physical symptoms of grief. It doesn't mean that if you're grieving, you will have these. Um, you may have some, you may have none, you may have all of them, or you may have some that are not on this list. I think what's important about this is to recognize, what are you experiencing mentally and physically when you're grieving? So that way you can tackle it and manage it head on, so that you can heal physically and emotionally to be able to be your best self, your best, the best parent you can be, the best colleague and coworker that you can be, the best friend that you can be. Super important to understand these things about ourselves. Okay. I wanted to kind of, and Chloe, if you don't mind helping me with this, open up for just a brief discussion. Tell me a little bit about, or if someone doesn't mind sharing, what type of physical and emotional symptoms have you experienced with grief?
And if anyone wants to maybe try to raise their hand, I can hit allow to talk and you can share in that way. And in the chat, someone mentioned
Okay.
overeating. And I see someone has their hand up. Chest pain and
Mhm.
anxiety. Well, it's not showing me who has their hand raised. Good. Dizziness, extreme anxiety, lack of energy, wanting to sleep all the
Mm-hmm.
time, sadness, pressure to be there for other family members,
Mm-hmm.
withdrawing, poor hygiene, irritability, avoidance, not wanting to go to the funeral,
Okay.
lack of motivation to do
Mm-hmm.
anything, lost interest in exercise, relief, and guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like that was it.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, there's.
Wanting to hold, sorry, the last one was wanting to hold on to the last items for remembrance.
Oh wow. Yeah. I appreciate all of you sharing. It's amazing to see um, some of the things that I mentioned on the list, but then there's others that, you know, are on there that, I didn't mention. And it just goes to show how complicated and complex grief is. It takes a toll on you physically and mentally. There is that tendency, to not want to go to the funeral. That's a painful thing to go through, and wanting to avoid it, I think, is a natural response. But we know, and I'll get into that in a little bit, we know that going to the funeral, going to the memorial, if that's what your family does after the death of a loved one, is so important. It helps us to process. And I'll talk a little bit about that and get into that in a little bit. But I wanted to share with you a way that can help you to understand your emotions that you're experiencing. Now, if you're a therapist, and this is something that I do and that I find to be extremely helpful, is being able to visualize what that feels like. What does that grief feel like? What do these various feelings feel like? And we'll do this in the grief circle in a minute. But this first one that I wanted to talk through is just having your client, or even doing this exercise yourself, visualize that grief. Okay, where do you feel that grief at? Okay. And so for me, I feel it, I don't know, it just feels like a weight. I sometimes, when I think of my nephew, I feel it in my chest. Um, does it have a color to it? It has like a dark color. I feel like it's sort of like a dark blue. Does it have a size? It feels big. It feels really big. Does it have a shape? It feels like a giant square. Does it have a texture? It feels sharp. Does it have a temperature? It feels it feels kind of cold, in a way. And so being able to visualize what this grief might look like and feel like to you, or help your clients to visualize it, is so helpful. And I'm going to go into a relaxation exercise later on that can kind of fit with this. So if that person has that, just that big block of heavy grief in their chest, what can we do to help them to dissolve that block and give it a different texture, a different color, a different temperature? And I'll do an exercise later that can help with that. Um, the next activity I wanted to do, and this might be kind of hard to do if we can't like share cameras, but if you guys don't mind jumping in the chat, if you have like, and I should have mentioned this earlier, I forgot, but if you have like colors, markers, pencil colors, grab those, grab some paper. I notice that sometimes also not just doing activities during a presentation, but doodling helps me kind of like, I don't know, it's like focus, and it kind of gets out some of the excess energy that I may have having to sit there. So yeah, if you guys have something like that, go ahead and take it out. And I could just be a pencil and paper, it doesn't matter. Or you can do this visually if you'd like. If you could just draw a large circle, okay, and write the word grief in that circle. Just write that word. Now think about the emotions that you feel when you're grieving. What are those emotions? And we talked about some of those, and a lot of you mentioned, anxiety, relief. There was guilt, there was lack of motivation, there was just like anxiety, wanting to avoid things. So let's think along the emotional line. What emotions do you feel with your grief? Grief is complicated. It's hard to understand that, which is why I like doing the grief circle exercise with clients. And this has also helped me as well, to understand my grief. When we can separate out these various emotions and see the anxiety. Okay, I have anxiety, I have anger, I'm mad. I'm so angry that my person died. Um, I'm worried. I'm worried that someone else I love is going to die. When we can separate those out, we can address them. But when our emotions are jumbled up and mixed up, it causes confusion, and it's hard to process through all of these difficult emotions. So, does anyone want to share what they put in their grief circle? You can throw that up on the chat, and Chloe can help me with that. And also, what color would you put to each of those feelings within your grief circle? This is important. What color would you put to that?
Someone said anger, so red or firelight.
Yeah,
Um, regret and using brown for that. Loved and pink. Tired with gray. Emptiness, black. Numb, black. Those seem to be pretty
yeah,
similar. Sadness, anger, disappointed, disbelief, happiness, and all of them blue.
yeah,
Helpless and anger, both in red. Regret, sadness, guilt, a yucky
hmm.
green. It's good to describe the type of color
Yeah, it's
too,
super
right?
helpful. Thank you for describing that, because it might not be a typical green that we think of. It might be like a really
Right.
yucky green. Yeah, that gives you a different picture.
Then let's see. Emptiness, white. Longing, light gray. Loneliness, black. Anger, red. Irritability, orange. Anxiety, maroon. Frustration, brown. And then the last one is longing, fatigue, regret, mad, sad, devastated, guilty, all a big blob of gray and slate.
Hmm. That's really powerful images that you can picture. It has a feeling to it, doesn't it? When you hear that yucky green or that black emptiness or numbness, it gives it like it names it. It helps you to visualize it. And when we can name and visualize our feelings, we can begin to understand them and process through them, which is so important. These are things you can do for yourself to help when you're grieving, but also to help clients or patients or your children. If you're a parent and you're grieving and your children are also grieving, these are really good exercises that can help them. And so, let's see. Oh, yes. So I wanted to move on to this next slide. Okay. This slide was actually completed by an 8-year-old client of mine, or excuse me, this activity was completed by an 8-year-old client of mine yesterday. I wanted to share it because it's really powerful. And I learn from each person that I work with how their grief is, how it, or I should say they teach me, but I learn something from them. Each person that I work with, sometimes I'm in awe, especially with children. They are amazing and so resilient, but they still hurt, they still grieve. And this child's mom died recently unexpectedly. And so his grief, he said he was angry, he felt alone, But then, and this part gives me chills, he put joyful in there. And his dad started crying when he put that. His dad was in the session along with his siblings. And his dad said, he just was shaking his head like, I can't believe this child, his mom just died and he's putting joyful. And I told him, I said, I noticed that. And we talked through each one of these feelings and how they're okay to have, and I said, so tell me about joyful. Where did this, what does that mean to you? How is joy associated with your grief? And he said, because I know my mom is happy in heaven. And I was like, okay, I just learned something from this. And I teared up. And it's okay if you tear up when you work with clients. Just I think it's important to try to keep it in check because we don't want them taking care of us. But I teared up a little bit and I said, that is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I said, that's something that we can all learn. And boy, did I learn from this kid. I was like, you know what? I miss my nephew so much. But my belief is that he's in heaven with Jesus riding dinosaurs and getting all the tacos that he wants. He's not in pain. And I still have a connection to him. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But this child sharing this was so amazing. And I'm like, this is why I do this. This is why I do this. So I can help these kids to talk through their feelings because those angry feelings that he is having and those alone feelings, I normalize those. That's okay that you feel that way. Anybody would be angry when their mom would die. It's not fair. You feel lonely because you miss her. And so we just break down those feelings. But not only do I do that for clients, but I had to do that for myself. You know, I had anxiety, I had anger, I had extreme sadness, and a lot of these feelings that you all described, I had a lot of those. And I would find myself getting stuck in the what ifs and the it's not fair and why can't he be here right now? Why did he have to go through this? And those questions can really bog you down, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about that, how we can manage some of those thoughts in a little bit. But yes, I learn from clients every day, and it's usually things that will kind of like jog something in my brain to say, you know what, I think that's a good way to look at it. And so children, I mean, they're amazing. I love working with kiddos. Okay, so I'm not going to try to get too academic on this, but I have just this huge interest in neuropsychology and the way the brain works and how things happening in our brain can explain a lot of our behaviors and a lot of our, just um, physical symptoms, emotions, behaviors, and all these various things. And when we can understand something, knowledge is power. It helps us to be able to combat that when we can understand something. And so the brain is pretty amazing. But what I love about it is that we can actually rewire our brain to change the way it thinks and responds to things like anxiety. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, we're still going to have emotions and deal with them. But when we're stuck in emotions and are dealing with things like depression and extreme anxiety, there are things that we can do that can actually change the way the brain works, which is pretty amazing to me. We have that power within us. So, oh, I forgot to move on to the next slide. There we go. So, what happens to our brain during grief? So, I'm just going to go over a few points here. I'm not going to stay too long on this topic, but basically, neurological changes happen in our brain when we're grieving. And so, there's several areas in the brain that play a role in our emotions. So I'm just going to throw out two of the areas that I think are important to mention with grief. Our limbic system, so that's kind of like that part of our brain that helps us kind of like the amygdala, watch out for danger and make sure that we're safe. And then the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex involves emotional regulation, memory, multitasking, organization, and learning. So those two parts of the brain are affected. So you can kind of see where some of the grief symptoms that we talked about might come from. Basically, your brain is being flooded by neurochemicals and hormones. And so your body's going to respond in a certain way. Your brain is going to respond in a certain way. And we know that the brain and the body have this connection. We know that they do. So when we can take care of how our brain is working, like by working on changing our thoughts, and when we can take care of our physical self by, for example, exercising and doing those things, it helps us to get through those difficult emotions that can deplete us physically, mentally, and emotionally. So this is super interesting. Brain imaging studies show that there's actually an increased activity in the network of neurons associated with our mood, our memory, our perception, conceptualization, so how we piece things together, and the regulation of our heart, digestive system, and other organs. So when we're grieving, our brain is being activated in the mood area, the memory area, the area that we perceive and understand things and make sense of things, but also the parts of our brain that regulate our organs. And interestingly enough, research shows that emotional pain activates the same regions of the brain as physical pain. So I find that to be super interesting. That's why when a person who's extremely anxious or depressed, you'll see physical symptoms like rapid heartbeat, worry, and some of these symptoms aren't, of course, they the mental emotional part too, but you'll see emotional and physical symptoms tied together. So when we feel sick in our brain, we usually feel sick in our body. That's because both parts of our brain are being activated. And so I already talked through these things, but just for your information, again, there's changes that take place in our brain. So the things that are happening to us when we're grieving or going through an intense emotional time, there's a reason for that. It can help us understand, okay, I'm a normal person who's grieving. This is my brain that's dealing with all these big emotions, and my brain is affecting my body, and I feel sick in my body because of all of those things that are going on. It's normal, totally normal. And then I talked about areas of the brain that play a role in emotions, those parts of the brain like the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And then remembering that there's all these neurochemicals that are bouncing around and hormones in our body, which cause a lot of physical symptoms. So this helps really, I think, when we understand, okay, I'm going through these things emotionally and physically because I'm grieving. The good thing is, despite these going on, there are ways we can combat them so that we can move through that grief in a healthy way. And speaking of moving through that grief, let's see. I wanted to kind of touch a little bit on what happens in our body during grief. And I did mention that. Talked about brain imaging studies, super fascinating. I find that to be amazing how our brains are designed to heal themselves, and our brains are affected in such a way that it gives off signals, which I think those physical symptoms come out, and these emotional symptoms that tell us, hey, something's off. You need to take care of yourself. We have to pay attention to that when we're feeling these intense emotions or these physical pains. We have to pay attention to that because that's a signal that something's not quite right in our body and we need to take care of ourselves. Let's see. Oh, let me go back here. Okay. So I think we sort of know this and I touched on it a little bit, but there are ways that grief affects our body. So we can have headaches, dry mouth, which is interesting. Remember, when our brain is grieving, it's affecting all of the functions of our body. chest pain. And then this is actually from WebMD, but there's a little note here that says, to call 911. So if a person is having like severe enough physical reactions, it's always good to just check things out medically to make sure that there's nothing else going on. Um, and then there may be stomach pain, fatigue, tiredness, a decrease in appetite, or maybe an increase in appetite. Some people overeat when they're really emotionally overwhelmed, nausea, shortness of breath. And again, there's a little note here to kind of, consider, is this, anxiety, or is it, that something else is going on? You always want to make sure that you're taking care of the physical. And if you're having any kind of pain, that you're making sure that it's not medical. But it is important to kind of understand these pieces and how they work. I wanted to touch a little bit about the way grief can affect us physically to the point of complications. And so this is where the self-care comes in, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Um, but it's interesting, and I didn't realize some of this. We know that any type of emotional pain can affect our immune system, but it actually, like, the word that was used in what I was reading was that it batters the immune system. So it literally lowers your immune system, making you more likely to get sick. And then it can actually cause increased blood pressure, can be linked to heart disease. And we know that stress can kind of connect up the emotional and physical aspects of grief, right? So when we're really worried about something, or overwhelmed by something, it not only is it emotional, but it might affect, our blood pressure and our digestive system, and our breathing, our muscle system, everything. And then important to note that emotional stress can activate the nervous system as easily as physical threats. And so when we feel things physically and we can't identify the cause for it, usually it's something that's going on. We're worried about something, or we're grieving, or we're stressed and overwhelmed, or we're anxious, or all of the above. And so it's important to recognize these things because, like I said, with those feelings, when we recognize them, we can manage them. And that knowledge is power. And when we have that, it can help us to get through some of the most difficult times of our life. Um, I wanted to, and also, if you guys have questions as I'm going through this, please feel free to drop it in the chat, and we'll have time for questions and answers at some point. Let's see. Okay. I want to kind of shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the stages of grieving. So, this is like an older model. When I was actually the medical model, some of you may know it as, when I was working on my master's degree in counseling, there was this model. So, there were the stages of grief. And I think when you hear the term stages, it suggests that we go through these stages and then we're done. And that's not the case with grief. Grief has layers, it has pieces, and those layers can get really complicated, and those pieces can get mixed up very easily. So I think it's important to look at it in a way that, I tend to look at it. And I know the Children's Bereavement Center, this is something that I learned through the Bereavement Center. This is what we help people to work through. And we use the model of Worden's tasks of mourning. And this is actually one of his books. He has other books on helping kids or children cope with grief. And so these tasks, basically, there's few tasks that we have to look at working through. And what I like about these tasks is that it helps you see, okay, there's work that I have to do, but I can do this. And when I recognize that these are all the tasks that everyone who is grieving has to go through, it helps me to understand I'm not alone in this and I'm not abnormal. The first one is hard. The first one is hard, to accept the reality of the loss. Our brains have a way of helping us to get through really difficult times. And I think that's when that numbness comes in the beginning. And it is hard for us to accept that reality because it feels so surreal. It feels so unreal. And that initial numbness, I think, helps us to get through them or go through the motions of preparing for the funeral, going to the funeral, asking, or I should say answering questions, talking to people when they come up to you and say, I'm so sorry, being able to kind of say thank you and just kind of get through your day. But beyond that initial numbness that we have when we grieve, or when we're grieving, is it just doesn't seem real. So a big part of the initial work when we are grieving or are helping others to grieve is to work on accepting the reality of the loss. And I say work on because it's not just a thought, oh, I'm going to accept the reality of the loss and then I'll move on to the next task. No, it's a process. And for some people, it may be easier than others to kind of move through this. Being a grief therapist, I thought that this would be, I was like, I know what I need to do to kind of move through this, but it was so different when I was going through it. It was just, it was so different. Um, I had to figure out, okay, how do I accept the reality of this? How do I make sense of this? How do I work on moving past denial and moving, or I should say, moving through denial, moving through the numbness? And I think there are many things that we can do to work through this task. And I'll touch on that in a little bit, but it's so important. And it's also important, that we recognize these tasks ourselves and also be able to explain them to our loved ones, who may be grieving, or to clients or patients who may be grieving, you know. Um, so when they say, I just, this doesn't seem real, that's how everyone feels when someone that they love dies. Even though we know that death is a part of life, it's hard, it's painful, and it's a feeling that we can't quite explain sometimes. And so, again, this first task is really important to accept the reality of the loss. Um, the next one is to work through the pain of grief. We talked about those painful emotions. I think it's tempting to want to avoid them. But I think what's so important to understand from a therapist perspective is that the more we avoid something, the harder it becomes to face. It's not pleasant. Um, it's normal to want to avoid painful things, but it's so important that we confront these emotions, that we name them. And we did that grief circle exercise to make sense of them so that we can heal and, work on addressing how we're grieving physically and emotionally, so that we can do it in a way where we can still function and still, take care of ourselves and be our best for others, like I mentioned. The third task. So this is a task that I'm still working on, to adjust to an environment in which our person is missing. So here's another piece of the puzzle here. So we're needing to adjust this. How do I adjust to this? How do I adjust to a life where my 6-year-old daughter asks me, where's justice? Why can't God send him back? That's hard. It's so hard. And I had to figure those things out. I'm still figuring those things out. I'm still going back to task one sometimes. Sometimes I'm like, did this really happen? I find myself questioning it. I'm like, yes, it did. It really did happen. And then I'll go back to task two, the sadness and the anger and just these multiple emotions and just that heavy feeling. And I tell myself, okay, what are these emotions I'm feeling? Let me, break this apart so I can see, okay, I'm feeling angry. I'm angry because he died. Yeah. And anyone would be, and so I'm naming that emotion. I'm recognizing it so I can adjust to life without him here. When I say life without him here, he's still here though. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. And everyone's different with their beliefs, but I'll kind of touch a little bit on mine when we get to task 4. But so we've got all of these adjustments, life changes. There's internal changes. Who am I now that my person is no longer here physically? I can't talk to them. I can't, ask them for advice. I can't hug them. What does this mean for me? Then there's also external adjustments. What am I going to do now? My spouse died, and now I'm having to do the things that they did. Um, I may have to take on responsibilities that they have. So there's so much internal pain that you have to adjust to. Then there's the external. I have to be, and this is, just an example, but like for a parent who, or a husband who loses a wife, or vice versa, or someone who loses a partner, you're having to adjust to, perhaps these new roles. Being the caretaker and the person who pays the bills, and still having to go to work and having to do all these things. There's so much stress in that. Then there's also the spiritual component. And, like I mentioned, everyone has different beliefs spiritually. I'll touch a little bit on mine, but I think what's important is that we recognize what are our spiritual beliefs. Task 3, adjusting to an environment in which this person isn't here. There's also a spiritual component. It can help us question our beliefs. How could God let something like this happen? Question our values, our assumptions about the world. We might typically think the world is fair, but when someone that you love dies, the world isn't fair. So it makes you see everything through a different sort of lens. You're having to adjust to all these different things. So it makes sense that there's an emotional and physical toll that is happening, that you're going through, that's being, taken, so to speak. I wanted to share a little example from a client, actually the father of the child that I shared the grief circle with. He told me yesterday when I was talking to him, he said, I don't know how to make sense of this. He said, I, worked and my wife took care of the kids. And now that she's gone, I'm having to take care of the kids. And I found myself crying when I was making her lunch, or excuse me, the kids' lunch, because she was the one that would do that. And so he is having to adjust to a new role. And so there's so many different pieces to it. And when we can understand those pieces, we can work on putting them together. And sometimes we have to take them apart and put it back together again. And that may look different. And we may go through these tasks, sort of like, I've heard people use the analogy of a roller coaster or riding on waves. There's ups and downs. So during those down times, you may be going back to the task of, accepting the reality of it, and then managing the emotions, task 2. So this is a hard one. And again, I want to stress that, everyone grieves differently. Everyone um, moves through these tasks differently. And sometimes you go back, and then sometimes you move forward. And what's important is the moving forward. When you take those steps back, that's okay. That's a normal part of the process. Just know that there will be steps forward. It might be tiny, tiny steps, but it's still forward. And when you move back and you learn that there are things you can do to help you move through this grief, it helps you to take a little step forward again. And so all of this back and forth is normal. and to be expected. And there's things that we can do though, and I'm really excited to share some of those things with you. This is a hard topic to talk about. It's painful, it's difficult, it's not pleasant to talk about, but it's so important that we do and that we understand it, to be able to face difficulties, not just death and not just grief, but difficulties in life. And so the fourth task I wanted to touch on here is, so I kind of sort of feel like I've been going back and forth between task 3 and task 4. Um, but when I realized that I was in a place where I was trying to find a connection to my nephew, I was like, okay, I made it through the hardest part. And sometimes it's going to be painful and I'm going to go back to that beginning. But I know that I know that there's meaning in all of this, and I'm going to find this meaning. And there's a power in that, being able to say, yes, this is painful. Yes, this is hard, but I can do this. I can move through this. I may go back, but I can go forward again. So I think it's important to remind yourself that moving through grief doesn't mean that you forget. I think I had this fear that as I was moving through things that I would forget my nephew. This is a part where I tend to get choked up a little bit. I think just because it's so special, and that's okay. I'm going to allow myself to feel what I'm feeling. But I'm never going to forget him. I'm not forgetting him. But I had this fear that if I felt better about, like if I started feeling better, like not as sad, that it would mean that I was moving on and would be forgetting him. But that's not the case. It is not the case. And I have determined I'm not going to forget this kid. He changed my life. He changed so many people's life through his journey that no way am I going to let, myself forget him. And so we don't forget when we move forward. Give yourself permission as you find yourself moving forward to remind yourself that just because I'm feeling better doesn't mean doesn't mean I'm going to forget my mom or my dad or my brother or my sister or my child or my nephew or my niece or my friend or, anyone that you've dealt with losing. Doesn't mean that you're going to forget them. So I wanted to share a client experience. Okay, this part always makes me tear up as well. But I've been working with this child who was severely injured in a mass violence incident, and she has been working with her for a few years. She's about 9 now, and when I first started working with her, she lost her, a grandparent in this mass violence incident. And she first told me, she's like, I don't want to talk about it. She's like, my person died and it was really sad, but I don't want to talk about it. Okay, fast forward a few years ahead, or well, a few years down the road, I should say. She just now has begun to talk about her person that died. I didn't prompt it. We were working on an art activity, and she said, you know, she said, I remember when my person and I used to go out in the yard and pick chicken eggs. And I love that. I love doing that with them. And I was like, that's amazing that you remember that. And then she said, you know what else I loved? And I said, what? And she said, I loved making tie-dyed pancakes with my person. So they would put food coloring and make these tie-dyed pancakes. And so that, I don't know what it is about her story, but tie-dye pancakes sticks with me. So I'll think of that sometimes and I'm like, what are my tie-dyed pancakes with justice? What are those? So um that's pretty powerful, right? That a child can share that. And she shared that on her own. And she started making a memory book about her person. She put pictures in the book of her person. She had found notes that her person wrote to her, like little notes like, good morning and I love you. And she put that in her book. And she said, she goes, it's really, really hard to think about sad things. And she said, and I miss them, but I don't want to focus on the sad things. I want to focus on the happy things. And I was like, the tie-dye pancakes and picking the chicken eggs. And she goes, yeah, that's what I want to focus on. Did I mean, this is one thing that gets me choked up too. I learned so much from this child that it reminded me, I was like, I want to be like her, I want to be able to do this with my nephew. And so the way I'm finding a connection with justice is I have started making a scrapbook, and it is just a little, just very slowly, I have his obituary in there, and then the bookmark. Oh, the bookmark. So he made a bookmark for me last year. I wish I had it with me. It's on my bedside table, but I have it in a book that I'm reading. And for a while, I wanted to put it in my scrapbook. And my sister said, don't put it in your scrapbook. She said, use it. And this is, of course, Justice's mom, my sister. And I said, I'm afraid something's going to happen to it. And then I was like, you know what? I can't let that thought stop me from using this bookmark. So it's just this, like, it's construction paper, and it has these little googly eyes on it. And there's like this glitter glue, and it's like super cute. And then it's like wrapped with like contact paper, like clear contact paper. So that's my bookmark from Justice. I have that. So I've decided not to put it in the scrapbook. I'm going to use it. Um, but not only that, we're going to have sushi on his birthday every year because this child loved sushi. What 3-year-old loves sushi? But through him, actually, I developed a taste for sushi. So I find that I feel connected to him when I eat sushi because I'm like, this 3-year-old kid liked sushi. And I was like, just marveling at how funny children are. And so that's something that I do. That's something that we're going to do on his birthday. We're going to have sushi on his birthday every year. And then something else that I've kind of found a new calling for is, just donating to research. So St. Jude's, Justice was in treatment at St. Jude's. St. Jude's is just phenomenal. I didn't realize it until I saw everything that they did for Justice and my family. Nobody has to pay for anything there. I'm going to try not to get into a commercial here, but they also helped with funeral expenses for Justice. But, so it's just pretty amazing the work that they do. So I donate to St. Jude's. I pray for these kids who are fighting cancer. I am a part of a support group for families that have lost loved ones to the type of brain tumor that he had. I keep up to date on research. I'm, on finding a cure for this. I'm following a story of this 21-year-old boy who has this type of tumor, and it's usually found in younger children around like 3 to 7, I think. But he's 21, and he said, this kid has taught me so much, but I've been following him and praying for him and sending support for him. And he has just undergone a trial treatment where, it's showing promise. And so a player for the Chiefs bought tickets for he and his dad to go to the Super Bowl. And I'm so excited for this kid's family. And he said in one of the posts that he put up, he said, I'm going through all of these treatments so that a little child doesn't have to. Just amazing. I've become connected to others who are dealing with this type of cancer in their child's life or in a family member's life. And so I'm finding meaning in it. I'm trying to figure out a way to make his memories not only stay with me, but mean something to others. And it gives me this motivation and this courage to be the best counselor that I can and to help others who are going through similar struggles and to help others who are grieving. With that being said, I wanted to kind of take a brief 5-minute break in case anyone wants to grab a snack, use the restroom, And I'm going to turn my camera off for just a second and come back on in just a minute. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them through the chat. And in about 5 minutes, I'll jump back on. Thanks so much, everyone. I appreciate you all being here. The restroom, and so I could take a little quick voice break. Yeah, please feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat or any comments. It's helpful for me, also to kind of get your perspective on things. And, like I said, everyone grieves differently. So it's pretty important to be able to share those things. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started and give everybody a chance to jump back on. And I appreciate you all sharing a few hours on your Friday evening with me. Yeah, it's almost the weekend, Super Bowl weekend. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I wanted to touch a little bit on how there are different issues to consider with grief. So we know grief can affect us all in different ways, but I think sometimes people may forget that there's going to be different effects depending on the type of death. So, for example, when you look at suicide, this adds a whole other piece or element or layer to grief. Not only are you missing your person, but then there can be feelings of guilt, like, why didn't I notice something? Or why didn't I do something? Or did I cause this? Is this my fault? Which, interestingly enough, working with children in grief, children tend to blame themselves for things even when logically and realistically it's not their fault. They blame themselves for things like when their parents get divorced. They blame themselves for many different types of things, but also as adults we blame ourselves for things, or we beat ourselves up for things that we maybe didn't notice or think that we should have noticed. And I'm going to get into those shoulds and those thoughts that can kind of that can actually weigh us down, and ways that we can combat that. So there's this added element of feelings that are so complex depending on the type of death um, that the person dealt with, and or that you're dealing with, depending on how your person died. Then there's also homicide, the unfairness of it, to have someone that you love be taken away in a murder. It's not something I've ever dealt with. I can't even imagine the anger, the just the anger. I think that's the feeling that stands out for me, and the unfairness of it. How could someone take away my person's life? It's wrong. So that can add a certain element of or layer of our feelings and emotions. And then accidents. So when an accident happens, it's so sudden. There's a nature to a grief when there's a sudden loss. Like, for example, through an accident, it hits us out of the blue, it blindsides us. And so we're having to deal with that disbelief. And we talked about Worden's first task of mourning. We're having to deal with that numbness, that, sense of, unrealness out of the blue. And that can be really tough to manage. Just that, well, I was just talking to, my person this morning, and now they're not here. That can't be right. And so there's an element to that, as well as illness. When we have someone that we love, and this is the one that I dealt with. When we have someone that's ill, we're experiencing what's called anticipatory grief. I grieved when I found out he was sick and what the diagnosis was and what the prognosis was. I grieved when when Justice had his first brain surgery. They had to put a shunt in to help regulate the brain fluid. Um, I grieved when he was discharged out of the hospital and they had a few options, one of them being going to St. Jude. I grieved when he was going through radiation and a trial treatment that wasn't successful. I grieved when they sent him home from St. Jude. I grieved when they put him in hospice care. And of course, just not being able to see him during COVID was really hard because he had cancer. And so, I'm going to touch a little bit on that, I think, as I'm talking about anticipatory grief and COVID-19. I couldn't be there with them as much as I wanted to. And there was a certain point when my sister called and said, you need to come over. You guys need to come over and see Justice. And so we did. And we wore our masks and we washed and sanitized our hands and we kept a little bit of a distance. But um, I was able to see him when he was deteriorating to the point where he could hardly raise his head, but he could still see us. And then was able to go see him the day before he died because you could tell. And I remember my sister saying he just doesn't look well. And so he was unconscious at that point. So I was able to see him and hold his hand and tell him I loved him. Even though he wasn't conscious, it helped me. And I cried and I cried and I cried. But there were all those pieces of grief that happened throughout this time, that I dealt with. And then he died. And so I had to deal with the actual death. So I had this grief upon grief upon grief upon grief built up, and then his actual death. So there were so many different pieces to that. And when you have a person that you love that is ill and you see them going through pain, there's a conflict there. You want them to be better, but then and of course you have hope and you pray that they'll get better because that helps you get through the day. But then sometimes you see the reality of the illness and you're like, I don't want them to go through this. But then you feel bad for thinking that and you're like, but I don't want them to die. And it was this constant back and forth that I dealt with. And it was just, it was a journey. It was a journey like no other, and a journey that I learned a lot from. And I'll talk a little bit about that too. And I've sort of touched on that. But I also wanted to point out that we don't just grieve in a bubble. So we have life issues that happened before grief came along. We have family problems, stressors, maybe health issues ourselves, maybe an existing mental health issue. So it's important to recognize that. So people, like I said, don't just grieve in a bubble. They're dealing with all these things. So not only do you have to manage the grief and work through those tasks, you have to take care of any existing mental health problems that you have. So a person with depression or anxiety may become more depressed, more anxious when grieving. It's important to take medication if you have medication. If you're struggling to the point that you're not getting better or a little bit of relief at some point, you might want to talk to a counselor, a grief counselor. You might want to talk to, a doctor if you become so depressed or anxious to the point you're having trouble functioning. Just some things to consider. And the next thing I wanted to touch on is grief and trauma. So here we have another layer of difficulties to deal with. I talked about the child that I work with that was injured in a mass violence incident. Not only was she grieving the loss of her person and having ongoing medical issues, but she was traumatized. So she was having to deal with the trauma as well. Now, I myself noticed that, kind of speaking to the mental health piece and the trauma, that there were these reoccurring thoughts that I would have about Justice dying, and it was becoming very difficult for me to manage. And so I got counseling. I worked with a wonderful therapist who did EMDR to help me process out the traumatic thoughts that I was thinking about his death. There was a trauma in that, I think, for me. And I can think back on those traumatic thoughts, and they're still there, but they're manageable. And I think that's the goal with therapy, is to help you manage emotions and have a safe place for someone to help you hold that grief and work through that trauma and work through that grief. I touched a little bit on grief and COVID-19 when I talked about not being able to see justice, but I see this being something that people are dealing with now and will be dealing with for, a long amount of time. Early on, people weren't able to go to the hospital or have funerals to say goodbye to their loved ones who died from COVID-19. Not having that closure is so hard to imagine and to talk about, because we need it as part of the healing process. So for people that weren't able to do those things, it's so important that they figure out a way to have a memorial for their loved one and to say goodbye to their loved one, to be able to again move through those tasks of grief. So I thought that was really important to touch on, given 2020 and this year as we continue to deal with the pandemic. Um, okay, so next thing, I wanted to talk about recognizing the effect, oh, excuse me, sorry about that, of grief on ourself and on others. The reason I started off by talking about how our brain is affected when we grieve and how our body is affected when we grieve and the emotions and physical symptoms that we have is because we have to be able to recognize those things so that we can take time off of work if we need to, which I highly recommend doing. I know in some cases, depending on your work, you may not be able to take off for bereavement time, depending on the relationship you had with your person. But if you are, I highly suggest it. It helped me. At first, I wasn't going to take time off. And then I talked with my bosses and they said, yeah, you should probably take some time off just to give yourself some time to process this. And I did. I took about 3 days and it helped tremendously. I was able to cry and sleep in and, you know, um, do nothing at some time during some of those times. And it, it helped me a great deal, but also it gave me time to process my own grief so that it wouldn't carry over into my work as a therapist. Or, we need to process our own grief, our own feelings, so that it doesn't negatively impact our therapy work or whatever type of work we do as a professional or caregiver. We have to be able to recognize that. Um, I talked about Justice's celebration of life. So we had a birthday party slash celebration of life at our church. It helps, it gives a sense of closure, and not that when I use the word closure, it means that, you know, the grief is over and you're done. You've closed off that chapter. No, it just helps your brain to kind of say, okay, this person isn't physically here. I'm saying goodbye to my person. Um, it's really important to recognize your own limitations. I was having trouble sleeping in the beginning. I would wake up crying and I was really tired. And so I gave myself permission to transfer a few of my grief cases over to another counselor. I gave myself permission to take a step away from grief work for a little bit so I could do my own grief work. I recognize that as a limitation. I didn't want to be talking to um, a child or a family member about their grief and start crying overwhelmingly so. Which, little side note, it's okay as therapists if we tear up and maybe have a tear. I think it's just important to kind of recognize that we don't want to get too overwhelmed emotionally so that the client then feels that they need to take care of us and they don't want to share the depth of their grief. Um, but we're human. We're going to tear up. We might shed a tear. That's why it's so important to kind of, you know, work on our own grief, but not just grief, any huge emotions that we're dealing with or any major life changes. We want to be able to, you know, to work on those things so that we cannot let that carry over into other areas of our life. It doesn't mean that it won't, but it means when it does, we can manage it. Um, be gentle with yourself. It's okay to feel what you need to feel. Give yourself that permission to do that. Take care of yourself. This means not only mentally, but physically. And this is really hard to do. You all talked about, some of you mentioned feeling unmotivated, wanting to sleep a lot. That happens when we're grieving. And that happens when a person is depressed. You tend to want to avoid things and just sit with that sadness. We do need to feel that sadness. We do need to sit with it, but not to the point where we can't function. We need to then kind of move through these feelings, recognize them, name them, confront them, accept them. And then as we're doing that, take care of ourselves. It gives us a deeper strength to manage the toll that grieving has on us physically and mentally. Um, be gentle with yourself. Take care of yourself, love yourself, give yourself permission to feel what you need to feel. And also, I talked a little bit about grieving as a therapist, a professional caregiver. We have to do our own grief work so that we can successfully manage other areas of our life. Sometimes that might mean taking a break from grief work, using your bereavement time, taking a little bit of a vacation. Um, but also, and I think one of the biggest things through all of this is in the resources, I have a few research articles that I pulled up on grieving therapists and how it affects their work. And in one of the summaries, it talked about how, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. But it said that there were challenges and advancements in therapist work that they talked to in these studies. So the challenges is being able to grieve while taking care of others who are grieving. And so that might mean working on our own grief first, taking a little break, then coming back to the grief work. That might mean taking a break once we get back to grief work, taking a little bit of a vacation if we start feeling overwhelmed with it. Um, and then the advancements, I think that the challenges part I kind of mentioned, how do I be a good counselor while I'm grieving? We do our own grief work. We might need to get counseling. The advancements, what we learn from this, how can it impact our career as a counselor, our calling as a counselor? Um, it gives us and the therapists that they talk to in these studies a deeper empathy. It helps us to see grief in a way that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. So while everyone's grief is different, and I don't understand what it's like to lose a spouse or a parent, I know what it feels like to lose a nephew, to lose a child in your life that you love. And I understand the unfairness of it. And I understand the physical and emotional pain that sometimes you can't quite put into words. And you think that no one understands. And while they may not understand your grief deeply, when you go through grief, it gives you a deeper empathy. And it is evident when you're working with a grieving family. They can tell when you're tuned into them and when you're holding their grief and when you in some way understand. Now, that's not to say that if you're a grief therapist and you've never, had someone close to you to die, that you can't understand grief. You can ask that person to teach you about grief so that way you can help others, but you learn from their stories of grief. And um, I also wanted to kind of talk about grieving as a parent. We have to take care of ourselves first. we have to take care of ourselves physically. We have to take care of ourselves mentally. And that enables us, like I've mentioned, to be able to be at our best in our profession, personally, as a parent, or, as a relative, to those people in our lives that we love. So, um, for example, I talked about my daughter. I think I briefly mentioned her. So my daughter's 6. Her name is Lily Ann, and she's amazing. Um, there were times when she would see me crying about justice, and she would say, "I'm sorry, mommy." And I'm like, "Thank you, Lily." I said, "I'm just really sad." So, and then I would kind of, make sure that I wasn't getting too overwhelmed in front of her. And I tended to cry on my own, when she wasn't around. So I wouldn't upset her. But I'm human. So I would cry sometimes. And I initially talked to her about justice when he first died because I wanted her to understand about death. I mentioned, sometimes people's bodies quit working because they're ill, and that's what happened to Justice. And so I talked with her, through the tasks of grief. And at first she's like, "Well, I don't want to talk about that." And I noticed that she was really angry and she would act out at times. And so I acknowledged her emotion and I didn't push it. I just said, "If you ever want to talk to me, come to me and we'll talk about it, because it's really sad." And one night, it was months after he died. I was laying down in bed with her and we were talking, and she started crying and she said, "I miss Justice. I want him to come back." And she started saying a prayer and she said, "God, send him back. Why can't you send him back? We want him here. We want him back home." And so I talked with her about that. And I said, "Yeah, you miss him. I miss him too." And I said, "We can talk about him and we can cry. And he's still a part of us. He's still in our life. We can pray when we're sad. We can look at pictures of him. We can watch videos of him. We can talk to him if we want to. He's alive in our memories." And so that's how I managed that piece. I really had to work on my own grief so that I could help others and be there for my daughter, to be able to work through her stages, or excuse me, her tasks of grief in her own time and her own way. And there's still times, like every so often, when she'll tell me, "I miss Justice." I was like, "Yeah, me too." And I'm like, "That's okay. We miss him." Um, Kids are wonderful. I know I said that before, but children are just amazing, and how they help us to heal. Speaking of healing, I wanted to move on to self-care. I know this is a word that we hear a lot, especially for those of you who are therapists, but it should be a part of everyone's life, excuse me, whether or not you're a therapist or not. So we know this, we all know this. Exercising is so important. Getting outside and exercising is even more important, because getting out in nature can be really healing and therapeutic. It is for me. Okay, so I have a gym at my apartment, and I'm ashamed to say I don't really go that much, but I like to kayak. I like to walk at the park. And so that's my exercise. And I notice when I get out in the sun and when I walk, it helps me to process through my feelings. It gets out all of these jumbled up feelings, because remember, there's that brain body connection. And so when you're walking, especially out in nature, like I said, there's something very, very healing about fresh air and being out around trees and water. That's very healing. But it gives you a way to release the physical and emotional stress that's just all over your body. So when we exercise, it releases serotonin, which helps combat cortisol, which is a stress hormone that builds up when we're overly emotional, whatever that may look like, whatever that big feeling may be. Drinking water. I talked to some of my colleagues about this before. Drinking water flushes out toxins. Our body is composed of water. We need to drink water. But not only that, I don't know if you remember when I talked about some of those physical symptoms. Um, it tends to give you like dry mouth when a person is physically grieving, it affects all of the systems in our body. And so when we drink water, it helps not only to rehydrate us, but to, flush out toxins and, help us to, have a healthier, better feeling. Speaking of healthy, eating healthy. So I've had a lot of people tell me I can't eat, I'm so sad I can't eat. Yeah, that's normal. Or I'm overeating, I'm stress eating. Okay, so what can we do to kind of manage that? And so for myself, I had a hard time eating. I am a person who, when I'm sad or really overwhelmed, I can't eat. It's like my whole system shuts down and I feel nauseous. And so to combat that, I think it can help to eat smaller, um, healthier meals throughout the day instead of saying, okay, I've got to eat these three big meals. That might not be doable for you, especially if you're grieving and feeling nauseous. Um, Try to eat smaller, healthier meals throughout the day. Or if you find that you're overeating, try to limit what you have in the house to healthier choices. And I know it's hard, but just some suggestions, and the work of grieving takes a toll on us physically and mentally. So if we're not eating, we're not going to have energy to grieve. Our brain is not going to be functioning properly. If we're not drinking water and not eating, we're going to be dehydrated and, undernourished. And our brains can't function without both of those things. And so the work of grieving is going to be even harder and more difficult. So find some type of physical exercise. It doesn't have to be going to the gym 5 days a week or 7 days a week, might mean taking a short walk when you're feeling overwhelmed, going, for a bike ride, going for a swim, whatever you love to do that's physical, that makes you feel better, do that. And try to drink more water and try to make sure you're getting some nutrition in. So, we're talking about self-care, addressing all parts of ourselves and healing. We talked about the physical part, but there's also the emotional, mental part. So we talked about our brains and our bodies and that connection. Not only do we have to take care of ourselves physically, but we have to take care of ourselves emotionally and mentally. For grief, I talked about seeking help if it's needed. If you find yourself having trouble functioning, that might be a good signal, that maybe talking to a grief therapist is helpful. Support groups are phenomenal for grieving. It's probably one of the most helpful supports and healing avenues to take when you're grieving. I know at the bereavement center we do support groups with children. The children have an outlet. They get to see that other kids are experiencing some of the same things that they are and that they're not alone. Same thing for adults and groups. Social support. I can't even explain to you how important this was for me when dealing with Justice's death. I remember, calling my great aunt. She's 84. Aunt D is her nickname. Well, I called Aunt D and she was grieving the loss of Justice as well. Not only that, it's my grandmother's sister, my grandmother who passed away in 2020. She was grieving the death of her sister. So I would call her, such a wise woman, and we would talk. It helped me so much. And um, a side note, her husband had also died several years back. And so she had dealt with all these different losses and then losses much earlier in her life, of parents and other family members. And talking with her helped me so much. If there's someone that you can talk to, it helps. Or even if you don't feel comfortable talking about your grief, call and talk to them, just about how you're having a hard time. And, can we get together? Can we have coffee? Can we go, do something together? So important. I think another emotional mental outlet for grief is having hobbies. That can be like, it just can be helpful to have an outlet, something to focus on. That could be anything, that could be art or bike riding, kayaking, walking, whatever that looks like, finding something that gives you an outlet. And By the way, art is super helpful for grief. Kind of like when we did the grief circle, when we can put our feelings into other mediums like paint or drawing, it can be healing. We can express our feelings in other ways because sometimes we can't quite put them into words. Challenging negative thoughts, super important. When you find yourself thinking, and this is a process, and sometimes we might need therapy to help go through the process of challenging negative thoughts if it's too hard, and it can be hard. It's hard work. We find ourselves thinking, "What if?" or "Why?" um, or "I should have." Those are clues that we're going down a dark path that will be really hard to come back from. So when we find ourselves thinking, you know, um, I could have done something, tell yourself, you know what, I did the best that I could. It wasn't my fault. And, I'm doing the best that I can now. And for my health now, I'm not going to focus on this thought. And so that's going to be as important as well. Mindfulness and relaxation. Anything you can do to relax and bring yourself into the present is really, really healing and therapeutic. And I have an exercise we'll be doing here in just a little bit to kind of show you that. Um, I read an article that was super interesting, but it gave like a helpful tip that I hadn't thought of. But with my work with anxiety, sometimes I'll tell people, you know what, you're spending all this time worrying. Why not give yourself a certain amount of time each day to worry? That's your worry time. So it might be 30 minutes. Um, but the article talked about having sad times. So maybe give yourself a certain time to feel sad about your loved one because you want to feel these feelings. But it also noted that you want to schedule these sad times when you don't have to be productive. So, like, not when you are in the middle of your workday or something. But also, it said to, and this is really hard because this is where I struggle before going to bed, avoid sad thoughts before bed. And this is so interesting. But it said that the electrical activity diminishes in the brain regions that are associated with our reasoning, our ability to think in a way that is reasonable. So it affects our analytical reasoning, and our just our all of our reasoning is out the window when we're going to bed because the electrical activity in that part of our brain is shutting down so that we can rest. So that's why if you can do something relaxing before bed, it can help you to be able to rest better. I'm just kind of, I know it's a little bit off topic, but try to keep yourself busy so you can avoid sad thoughts before bed. Um, and then, okay, so this next piece, crying, is we know crying is important. And when we grieve, we cry. Although some people may not experience crying to the extent that others will, and that's okay, everyone's different. But interestingly enough, tears, okay, so when like a lab took a sample of tears, and within tears, there are toxins that are being released from our body, but there's also cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So not only is it giving us an emotional release when we cry, but it's also actually physically releasing a buildup of toxins and cortisol that is contributing to our stress levels. It's pretty fascinating to know that. So cry when you need to cry. It's important. It helps you to release not only emotional, mental pain, but physical. Um, it's a physical release as well, which is really fascinating if you think about it. Our brains and our bodies were designed to help us to heal. And when we can tap into that, we can get through anything. I'm just going to touch a little bit on spiritual issues. It can look different for everyone. It might be, that you don't have religious beliefs. So, what is a spiritual connection for you? It might be nature. If it is a religious connection, it might be prayer, attending a religious organization. It might be some type of meditation. All of these are going to be extremely important. and can also provide another means of social support. It can provide an outlet emotionally, when you pray and when you talk to others or when you meditate. So just some things to think about. To kind of summarize, we want to be able to recognize our emotions, name them, confront them, work through the tasks, and work through healing by addressing self-care through all of our parts, our mental and emotional, our physical, and our spiritual selves, which only when you address the whole, um, it will only make your healing more complete, and um, it will make the grief journey that you have manageable. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this is the activity that I wanted to do. We're getting pretty close to needing to wrap up to do our questions and answers, but I wanted to do an exercise. This is a meditation exercise, but I threw in a mindfulness aspect to it. So when we are grieving, we're tending to be in one of two places. Not in the present, though. Usually with sadness, we're going to be in the past and, missing that person, thinking those what ifs. With worry, like fear of something happening to someone else we love, we tend to place ourselves into the future. And our minds can really only do one thing successfully at one time. So if we can bring ourselves into the present by focusing on what's going on around us, it can be extremely healing, extremely therapeutic, and very important that we be able to do that. So what I want you to do is, and it may be hard if you're like in an environment where it's not super quiet, but do the best that you can. So if you can close your eyes and breathe in slowly through your nose. Okay. And then hold your breath and then slowly release any tension and any negative, uncomfortable feelings or thoughts that might be in your mind or in your body. Continue to breathe in, and you may want to tense your muscles and breathe out. And as you release the tension, visualize yourself letting go of any discomfort, physical, emotional pain that you may be feeling. And say, tell yourself something positive like, I'm okay, I'm going to be okay. It helps to have that verbal with it. And so as you're breathing in and breathing out, continue to do that. And, you know, breathe out the tension, the stress, the big emotions, the discomfort that you may have in your body. And as you're breathing, notice the thoughts and feelings as they come. Don't judge them, just observe them, accept them, breathe them out. Okay. Okay, just continue breathing. Okay, and tell yourself, I'm okay. I can do this. I can manage this. And then, if you want, you can open your eyes and continue breathing and focus on relaxing your body and your mind. I want you to look for something that you see around you. I like to use the five rule. What are five things that you see? So in my office, I see there's a plant behind me. I have some aromatherapy oils going, which, by the way, is another really helpful way to de-stress and, to take care of ourselves. I got some lavender and peppermint and lemon, which I also smell. So smells good. I notice my phone. I've got my phone here. I've got some tissue. I've got a bottle of water. Okay, what do I feel? Notice what you feel around you. I feel myself sitting on a soft chair. I feel the armrests on my chair. They're kind of hard. I feel my desk. I feel my sweater, which is cozy. Um, and then I feel the air coming from the air system. And then what do you hear? So what do you hear? What are 5 things that you hear around you? I hear the mister, I hear the air on in the office. I hear quiet. It's pretty quiet here today. And I think that's not the only things that I hear. I hear myself talking. Um, what are 5 things that I smell? So I smell the oils and the mister, and I can kind of break apart the various scents that are in there. And if you're eating a snack, what are you tasting? So notice these things, notice them, notice what you're seeing, notice what you're, involve all 5 of your senses, what you're hearing, tasting, touching, smelling, whatever it may be, and pay attention to it. And what you're doing is you're in the present right now. You're not in that future anxiety. You're not in that past sadness. You're in the present. And this can be something that can be extremely helpful to do. And then the last thing I want you to do is look for something around you that brings you great joy and focus on that for a moment. What is it around you and your surroundings that brings you great joy? That's why it's so important to have pictures and things that make you smile at your workspace or in your home. It gives you a safe place to be and to relax and to heal from your day or from things that you're going through. But so for me, I noticed this picture of Lily Ann, my 6-year-old daughter. Oh, she was so young here. It's a picture of her in the blue bonnets, which I absolutely adore. When I see that smile, I'm like, I can do anything. When I see her smile, I can do this. So um, try to practice this when you're feeling overwhelmed. Just focus on your breathing, notice your surroundings, and it'll help bring you out of that difficulty. I wanted to kind of briefly touch on the light stream technique. So this is something that I would typically do in person and an in-person presentation, but I wanted to give you guys a picture of it. And at the end of the presentation, you'll be able to see my email. If you want a copy of this, I'd be happy to send it to you. It's from an EMDR book. I use this with clients who I'm not even doing EMDR with. It's called the light stream technique. And remember early on, I had you do the grief circle and identify feelings that were in your grief circle and talk, and what color did it have? What shape, size, texture, temperature? This is a relaxation exercise that helps us to visualize and relax. So you have the client or yourself, I do this myself actually, concentrate on an upsetting body sensation. So notice what's going on in your body, or have the client, draw their attention to what's going on in their body, you know, and ask them, where do you feel discomfort? Have them identify it in my chest. Okay. If that discomfort had a shape, what would the shape be? What would the size be? Would it have a color? What would that color be? And have them describe the color. And some of you talked about like the slate gray and this yucky green. The more detail they can put to the color, the more it helps them to visualize it. What temperature does it have? What texture does it have? Does it have a sound? What sound does it have? Which is really interesting. And a lot of clients find that to be helpful. They're like, it's this really loud, painful sound. It's like really high and screeching. Like, okay, okay. And then we want to turn the tables and bring the relaxation piece in. We want to kind of turn that, that discomfort, what is a color that you associate with healing? Have them identify that color. Tell them, imagine that this favorite colored light is coming in through the top of your head and directing itself at that discomfort, at that, that dark blue, heavy brick feeling in your chest. And let's pretend that the source of this light is coming from the heavens, or you can use any term, like it's coming from the sky. I use the sun. with kids. This beautiful yellow warm light is coming from the sun. And of course you use the colors that they're using. And the more you use, the more you have available. This light directs itself at that discomfort, that just that hard, uncomfortable place in your chest. And it surrounds and it covers and it permeates that shape. What's happening to that shape? And you have them continue visualizing that healing light that they've chosen. And as it's covering that shape, you walk them through it. It's disintegrating. It's finding any little piece that's left of this discomfort, and it's coming out of your body. And for kids, I'll say through the tips of your fingers and toes. Those yucky feelings are coming out of your body. They're not going to stay there with you. You're relaxing. You're focusing on your breathing. And then you just go through that. And then, at some point you can tell them, okay, I'm going to count to 5 and, open your eyes and, let me know how you feel. And the majority of the time, they're like, I feel so much better. I feel so much more relaxed. So the light stream is super helpful relaxation to help identify discomfort in our body. With grief, it lives in not only our minds, but in our bodies. And so when we can address that, it can be very healing. And so I think this is the last piece, and then we'll open up for questions. And I love this. I read this in an article I was reading from, they interviewed this lady who was grieving, and her name's Ann Davis. And she said, if you feel like your whole life has fallen apart, that's fine. It totally has. Now you get to decide how to put yourself back together. Be creative. There's a new life to be lived all around you. And that just spoke to me in so many ways. I'm continuing with my life, and it's hard sometimes, but I learned so much from Justice. I learned to appreciate the small moments, even those seemingly insignificant moments. I get to wake up, I get to breathe air, I get to make lunch for my daughter, I get to bring her to school. She's healthy, I'm healthy. I get to go to work and help people. You know, I get to take up causes that will help to find a cure for the cancer that Justice has or had. I get to do all of this. I get to still have a connection with him. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and close off. And thank you all for letting me share a piece of my heart and what I've learned. And there's still things I'm learning and still things I want to learn. And I want to give you all a chance to ask questions, or if there are any comments that you have, I'd be happy to touch on those as well. Chloe, if you don't mind helping me with that.
Yes, let me stop the recording.